Welcome to Mental Healthy, the podcast where we share stories of the professionals and experts worldwide working in the mental health field. Here's your host, Dr. Kenyon Knapp.
Well, welcome everyone to the Mental Healthy Podcast. I'm glad to have you with us here today. And I wanted to welcome my special guest, Dr. Christopher Rosik. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and maybe where you're from, educational background, with whatever you want to share.
Yeah, I am by profession, a clinical psychologist. I practice in Fresno, California, but my training was through the University of Oregon as an undergrad and then through the Fuller Seminary, the Graduate School of Psychology there in Pasadena. So that's where I got my training. I ended up coming to Fresno to work at a place called the Link Care Center. It's a Link Care Foundation, in part because it's part of the largest faith-based counseling center in the Valley, Central Valley here. So I really wanted to give back and work with the faith community, and Link Care particularly has a program that has worked with missionaries and clergy. It's kind of an intensive outpatient program, pretty well known throughout the world in a small little niche of member care within missions. So, and I've also had my little pinky in some research as a clinical faculty at Fresno Pacific University. So that's the basics.
Oh, that's great. Well, you've got a broad background and great educational training, and we've got a lot of respect for people from Fuller. I mean, I know a number of friends who've been there and had a really good time, so that's great. And I also know from what I've read about your background too, you deal with a lot of different subjects. You deal with the member care issue with missionaries and, of course, general counseling and all, but you've also worked with a number of patients over the years who had unwanted same-sex attraction. So I know there's lots of different terms for how you work with that subject, but what are some of the terms people use or terms you think would be best to talk about that subject?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. My journey as a therapist, I really started out early in my career focusing a lot on dissociative disorders because I encountered some of those and really needed to get to know what that was back in the day in the late 80s, early 90s. And so that was kind of a focus of my writing at that time. And then in the 90s, I got more interested, and I can talk a little bit about how I got into this other field, but I got into more of the area of care for individuals dealing with same-sex attractions, unwanted same-sex attractions. And obviously in the last 5 years or so, it's become much more also connected to gender, just incongruence kinds of issues. So yeah, I've done a fair bit of work there, but really it's not something that I would say, I'm not like some of the people in that field who have just specialized and that's all they do. I'm still like probably most psychologists, most therapists out there. I'm a generalist and I work with people across the spectrum of kind of conditions and concerns. And it's just that the issue with sexuality and gender are just areas that I think are a little more fraught with controversy. And I don't know, for some reason, I've always seemed to be drawn into areas that have been controversial. And so probably the last 20 so years, I've been a lot in this arena, but not necessarily all clients. Just I've done research in the area, and I continue to do research in the area.
Yeah,
we can get into that a little bit. So,
yeah, I'd love to talk about that. And yeah, I agree with you. When it comes to these hot button topics, like anything related to sexuality, the old expression is you get more heat than light. And some of these things, people just get all worked up, and they sometimes speak out of emotion rather than intellect. Sometimes, right. When it comes to sexuality issues, but since you've done research on this topic of sexuality and all that, could you sort of give us a little bit of an overview of maybe what the research says about sexual orientation and things along that line?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can take this in a number of different directions. In terms of, for the purposes of what I would talk about in my kind of research, there's a lot of research when it comes to sexual orientation in particular, and in a burgeoning projects in research and gender in the last 10 years, 10 years.
Uh-huh.
But my interest has been in particularly looking at individuals, since I'm coming from a faith perspective. And I actually say how I got into this particularly was having to do with in my work with missionaries and some pastors, finding out that these people, not all the time, but with some regularity, had one of their concerns was unwanted same-sex attraction. And so working with those folks back in the 90s, that's when we're having discussions about same-sex marriage. And I was hearing this equating of marriage with race. And I thought, okay, if we're going to treat sexual orientation as the same as race, that means anyone like these people coming to me, these missionaries coming to me, wanting to explore their potential for change, that, you can imagine within the culture, if it's being equated with race, like you're coming to me to change your race, that's crazy. So I could kind of see the writing on the wall. I'm not a prophet, like I've said, but I could see that if this cultural trend continued, it's quite possible that there's going to be an effort to prevent these sincere believers from being able to explore these issues, have the goal of even exploring their sexual attractions, to see the extent to which they might be able to change attractions and certainly behaviors and identities. So that's kind of how I got into it. Who's going to represent these people? And I did have a long talk with God prior to deciding, okay, I'm going to go public, because that was still back in the 90s and I still had a lot of my career in front of me. But I did choose to do that, stepped out in faith, I guess. And it's been quite an interesting ride since then. I would say I kind of got on the train with God about this issue, and I haven't really been in control of it since. I've just kind of taken the train where God is, the conductor has taken it, and it's been amazing. But it has been, I've the benefit of working at a faith-based clinic, that was a benefit, enabled me, I think, to do it a little bit as well. But I tell people there's a great freedom in being able to write and talk about these issues, in an intelligent way, in a scholarly way, but not having to self-censor like I know so many people do. And we need people, we need people to have courage and speak into the issues. But again, I would say intelligently. And there's a lot of, unfortunately, not very helpful rhetoric sometimes that comes out, kind of fear-based Christian rhetoric about the issues, which is not helpful.
Yeah, it's funny when you talk about everything you just did, you reminded me of what one of my African-American friends used to tell me. This friend would tell me that, overall, the civil rights movement in America has been fairly successful. Like, people have agreed that, Black people having the same rights as white folks and other groups is appropriate and a righteous kind of thing. And then they talked to me about how the homosexual movement is trying to sort of hijack the civil rights movement and compare the two. And I sat there and listened, and then they proceeded to tell me that they had a number of ex-gay friends, but they didn't have any ex-Black friends.
That's right. That's right. And that's the problem, right? Because certainly race is an immutable characteristic, sexual orientation, even the components of it it's very clear they're not immutable. They may be very difficult to change for some people, but they're not completely immutable, and some people do experience change. So when we talk about or I would summarize some of the research on change, I would say that what we talk about is categorical change. If you're going from only having same-sex attractions to having only opposite-sex attractions, that level of change is fairly rare. It does happen. At least I've talked to people who've reported that. But change can happen for a significant number of people on a continuum of change, right? If take a 7-point continuum, even 1 or 2 points on that continuum of movement, say, towards diminished same-sex attraction or increased opposite-sex attraction, can be very helpful for a person holding on to their marriage, right? Being able to aspire, if they aspire to a family, can be very helpful. So I think while there are claims to say that sexual orientation is immutable and it can never change. The research really doesn't hold up on that. The controversy is, I mean, I think most scholars who are integrate in the field would say, yes, spontaneous naturalistic change does happen. I mean, people just naturally throughout, not even trying, things happen. They change their identities, they change their behaviors, and sometimes their attractions even change. And it's a little bit more for women than for men, but it does happen for men. The big controversy is, can therapy or can a therapist, a counselor, ever do anything that could potentially facilitate this with a person, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the door closes, and no, that can never happen. So in a sense, naturalistic change could happen anywhere for some people or many people, but it could never happen if you enter into the therapist's office. So that's the kind of contradiction I think we're working with.
Yeah, it's interesting. I agree with you. There's a lot of ill feeling towards change efforts these days by therapists. But as I was reading some literature on this, I know that Anna Freud, Freud's daughter, Sigmund Freud's daughter, used to do sexual orientation change effort work, and Masters and Johnson reported a 71% success rate. I don't know all the nitty gritty of their, how they define that. But so it's a historical thing. But then, of course, in 1973, homosexuality was taken out of the DSM. And and of course, some people today would say that any kind of effort to change sexual attractions can be harmful. But then I've heard clients say that not changing what they don't want in their life is harmful as well. So I guess I need to ask you, you're the guest from a research standpoint. What does the actual research say about harm from either doing therapy with people to change attractions or to not do it? Like, where is the harm?
Yeah, well, from a methodological standpoint, the research is poor, I would say. It's infused with sort of advocacy interests on a number of levels. But having said that, I would also say, in the research I've done, there are practices that can be harmful, right? It's pretty universally understood that, some of the things that therapists who work in this area are accused of, typically by activists, is, electroshocks to genitals and ice baths and things like that, right? And yes, of course, those are harmful. I fully agree with that. And I would also point out that those haven't been practiced with sexual orientation for over 40 years, right? So, I mean, it's an effort to muddy the water, to, guilt somehow by association, to prejudice the culture against this work. So I think a thing to remember in the research that I've done, and one of the things I've been very interested in looking at is, the people that I often work with do not identify as LGBT, right? Don't identify, they don't have that sexual identity. And the research that's used to make many of the conclusions within the culture is almost exclusively with LGBT individuals. Big problem, because it generalizes from people who obviously, and if you're identified as LGBT, it's quite likely that if you had tried to change, you didn't succeed, right? And so I've compared it to studying and trying to determine the benefit and harm of marital therapy by only interviewing and researching individuals who've gone through marital therapy and have since divorced. Does that make sense? How I view the similarity of the field. And the people who do not identify as LGBT are never included in these studies, and yet I think their experiences are different. And they do experience. The one study I've done that looked at this, particular methods, suggested that some of these methods that could be interpreted as, change efforts or practice interventions towards change, that some of those methods, for people who identify as LGBT, they report that they're moderately harmful. But for people who don't identify as LGBT, which are obviously probably more religiously devout Christians with same-sex attraction, they report that those same methods are mildly to moderately helpful. But that kind of information just goes by the wayside because they're just excluded by definition in the methodologies of these studies that are being purported and conducted by secular institutions and academicians.
Yeah, so I'm hearing a lot of limitations on the data that's available on the subject because there's all this advocacy research and people who enter it with a bias and an agenda, and then defining of the terms of who is a good candidate for a research study is difficult as well. Because I guess finding a person that has confusion around their sexual identity or which direction they want to go is probably hard to find people to join a research study who are at that point in their life.
Well, there are people who seek counseling and seek, to determine the extent to which they may experience fluidity in their attractions or change in their attractions. But one of the other, issues that comes into play, again, is that if you're in that category and you've had some experience of a positive experience of it, how likely are you going to be to come out, right? Because you're going to be seen as having internalized homophobia. You're going to be seen as probably deceived, self-deceived. This couldn't possibly happen. So are you going to expose yourself and potentially your family to this kind of scrutiny? I don't think so. If you come out as someone who is an ex-gay, then yeah, you get acclaim, you get celebrity, you get all this, within the secular culture. So there's obviously an inhibiting dynamic within the culture for these people also not to be known. But they do exist. I know they exist. Obviously, doing research with some of them is good. But again, they're not going to go public usually.
Yeah, that makes sense given that lack of social desirability within certain circles. Okay, well, one of the things you're making me think about is, the ethics codes and ethical principles. Like I know, some of the ethical principles that we try to go by is like veracity, telling the truth, beneficence, what's doing, what's in the client's best interest,
right.
Autonomy, respecting the client's autonomy. But it seems to me that the mental health fields are really not respecting clients' autonomy sometimes when it comes to clients' choices in regards to therapy for unwanted same-sex attraction. Like I've heard from a lot of people, and I've observed it, that a lot of the mental health associations, the national ones, are against allowing sexual orientation change efforts. And I've heard a lot of different opinions on that. But why do you think that the national associations are so against sexual orientation change efforts?
Yeah. Well, 20 years ago, they weren't necessarily so against it. I think they would discourage it, but they weren't endorsing bans, which is now what they're doing, which I think suggests a shift in sort of the thinking and the leadership of these organizations towards social political left. And I think that's a big issue is certainly the leadership and to a lesser degree the membership of these organizations. I think I would describe it as kind of representing a ideological monoculture, right? Left of center. I mean, the APA I'm a member of the APA. I'm a member of some other organizations too, and I've kind of seen this shift. There's kind of a right now going on kind of this takeover, a DEI takeover. That's really actually quite fascinating. I've compared it, like when I went to Fuller, I had most of our classes, we were something about how does this relate to your faith? How does this relate to the Christian faith? And whether that's research or practice or anything, that was part of how we were encouraged to think. What's happening now within the APA is that same kind of seminary experience that I had, except now it's with DEI. How does DEI relate to everything you do? Everything you do has got to be seen through that lens. So yeah, it's getting at the fact that I think there's and we can talk more about this too, but ultimately what's beneath all this is a clash of worldviews.
So worldview differences are really what's underneath the cultural and legal battles to ban sexual orientation change
Yeah, yeah.
efforts.
Let me give you real quick. I want to just give you 2 points that I make to sort of support this notion that the mental health associations are reliably left of center. One of them was actually from 2011. This was back before same-sex marriage, but I remember in 2011, the APA Board of Representatives, which is their leadership council, they had a resolution basically to support same-sex marriage initiatives. And the resolution passed 157 to 0. So there's not one person in the leadership of the APA at that time who was willing even to come out and saying, no, I think the traditional form of marriage is probably the best for human flourishing. So, and that was before it was even passed. That's when the country was divided, relatively 50-50. The other thing I've been keeping track of as a member of the National Association of Social Workers is that's the one mental health organization that actually endorses political candidates for federal office. And so what's fascinating about that, I've been kind of monitoring this since 2014, and my latest calculations are since that time, they've endorsed, I believe it is 754 candidates for federal office, the House and the Senate and President. And you might guess what the ratio of Democrat to Republican endorsements are, and you probably wouldn't guess it. It's basically 753 to 1 Democrat endorsement to Republican endorsement. And that's a ratio that would be described, it has been described as a statistically impossible lack of diversity in a country that's relatively 50-50.
Mm-hmm.
But that gives you a little bit of what's going on and why these organizations are particularly so reliably left of center in their endorsements of not just politicians, but social issues, anything like that. They're pretty much, providing research and academic muscle towards the political left of center interests.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's true.
And I would say I don't have a problem with that, really. APA says that they're representing the science. No, if APA would just say, hey, we represent a strongly left of center take on the science, that would be okay. That would be honest. But it's not honest to say, no, this is the science. No. You're not studying. You're only studying half of it. Your research, you're only asking the questions that left of center people ask. You're not asking the kinds of questions that right of center people might ask that could well lead to different answers or shed a lot of important light on the answers that you do have to see where your blind spots are. So that's the problem with research generally, especially into these kind of cultural issues and change efforts in particular, our topic today.
Mm-hmm.
So who's going to research individuals who don't identify as LGBT? It's going to have to be someone like me for multiple reasons. One is because I have relationships with some of these organizations and they trust me. That's another obstacle to getting this research, is that understandably, if you have experienced change, you're not necessarily going to trust somebody from the APA coming wanting to do research with you. You're probably going to decline that survey. So the research I've been involved in, it's been quite a blessing in a lot of ways, and eye-opening in other ways, and frustrating in some ways, but it's been with an ideologically diverse research team, or the other researchers are LGBT identified. Another researcher's a little bit more conservative, I would say. So, that's been a really interesting process. But out of that, you do a lot of your blind spots are exposed.
Mm-hmm.
And you build an appreciation for, I can learn from these people. They can learn from me. And there's just not many places where that happens these days.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, a minute ago, we were mentioning the bans on providing therapy for unwanted same-sex attraction. How would you say that's affecting the profession, and how would you say it's affecting the church as far as, maybe mental health professionals in the church or in the professions offering therapy that
Right,
clients
right.
that clients want.
Yeah, look, from my perspective, the bans are really about intimidation. I don't know if there have been any professional licensed therapists since, excuse me, since these bans have been in effect for at least 10 years now in California. I'm not sure there have been any licensed therapists who have lost their license as a result of any of these laws now. Um, and you think about it, places like the William Institute has done research. They say, well, there's hundreds of thousands of minors being exposed to this. So we've got to have these bans. And yet there's really no one, I would think that if someone lost their license as a result of practicing conversion therapy, that this would be touted in the headlines. You'd see it all over. It would be a talking point, but none of that's happening. So I don't really see these bans as, I guess they would view them as preventive maybe, but preventive of what? If it's not happening, it's not happening. And so I do think it's more intimidation, and I think that's been pretty somewhat effective for therapists. There's very few that would be public like I am, that would say, like I say, I don't say I practice conversion therapy because I don't. I practice therapy, but I think there's the fear of being somehow, slandered with that term, and then people just are afraid of that and don't know how to respond to that kind of an accusation. So that's it's had a chilling effect, I think, on therapists, particularly maybe faith-based therapists, or therapists who have that worldview. But I would still believe that beneath the radar, there are therapists doing this work that are willing to, I would say that the work of being willing to entertain a client's goal of wanting to explore the possibility for change. Now, we don't give guarantees, right? That's unethical. And we use standard methods and things. But I just, I tell people, therapists should not be dictating what the client's goals are, but neither should mental health associations or politicians be determining and dictating what the client's goals are. That's kind of gets me riled up a little bit. That's kind of one of the reasons I got into this.
Oh, absolutely. Or limiting the client's goals, which is really what they're doing.
Yep. Yep.
And if the goals aren't, in political alignment with those more left-leaning politicians, they try to limit client goals. Well, let me ask you, I'm sure there's people listening right now who are therapists or therapists in training, because I've got a lot of listeners to this program. Obviously, the program is mental healthy, and I've got a lot of people in psychology, social work, and counseling listening. And they may have friends who have unwanted same-sex attraction, and they may want therapy to deal with that unwanted attraction. What are some resources that Christians maybe should know about?
Yeah. I am past president of an organization called the Alliance for Therapeutic Choice and Scientific Integrity. The website is therapeuticchoice.com, therapeuticchoice.com. In fact, we have a conference coming up. We have an annual conference. But we also put things on the website and have some referral therapists and things. Not as many as I think are needed, but there are some. So that's one resource. Just in terms of information, I would say also the American College of Pediatricians has some really good stuff, particularly for the gender issue. Christian Medical and Dental Association has some good integrated, scripturally integrated information about these topics. And on a more secular side of things, the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, it's segm.org, I think it is. They do some nice work with just reviewing the literature. You can go up and read articles that are out, and they will give a review of the articles that are coming out and the research that's coming out. I think from a not a cheerleading kind of perspective as far as yay gender affirming care. I think they are definitely not on board with gender affirming care as it's currently practiced. So there's a few resources. There are others too.
Yeah. Well, you're reminding me that There's a big wave of class action lawsuits in Europe right now, like related to the Tavistock Clinic and things like that, where people have just jumped on the bandwagon of promoting gender affirming care for minors, and they make life altering decisions, and there's a lot of bad outcomes.
Yeah, you're right. Exactly right. Before I forget, though, let me mention one other thing about the Alliance does. We do have currently a group for clinicians that come and talk about cases and talk about issues in this area for clinicians. I mean, you have to be a partner of the Alliance, but people who want to dig into that and get a sense of what that's like, that is very it's well attended. It's very interesting. I think it's a monthly meeting.
Okay. So it's a monthly meeting if you're a member of the Alliance for Therapeutic Choice and Scientific Integrity?
Yeah, you might be able to, I don't know the latest on it. You might be able to come as a guest once or something like that just to check it out. But I think you can get information on the website, or if not, someone could email me, I suppose, if they wanted to, and I can give you that information, or I don't know if you want to do that now or what.
This is good timing. We were starting to get to the end here.
My email, what I would say, Christopher Rosik at linkcare.org. That's ChristopherRosik at linkcare, linkcare.org, and I'll hook you up.
Great.
If you have an interest like that. So yes, we're running towards the end here, and there is a problem with the gender issue, and Europe is going the other way of America in this approach to gender affirming care. I think it's going to be fascinating, because I think it's really the first significant pushback there has been for this whole sexuality juggernaut, coming down from sort of again, a different worldview, I think. And so I really believe that there is a lot of concern. They've never got this kind of pushback, and they're going in the opposite direction. So there's got to be like a tremendous amount of cognitive dissonance going on within the APA right now. They're all in on this, but Europe is going the other direction. They're putting the brakes on, and within the American culture, there's a significant pushback in states, and they've never encountered that before. So like, how far, especially if the research that's going to be done in Europe comes back and says, no, this is not helpful, this is not benefiting minors, how far will they keep pushing it? That's going to be a fascinating cultural study particularly about these American mental health and medical associations.
Absolutely. Well, this is great. I really appreciate all the information and everything you've shared, but I tell you, before I let people go, I always ask them the catch-all question at the end of, we've covered a lot of ground today, but there's often like one last thing on your heart or mind that you want to share with the listeners before we wrap it up. So is there any final thoughts you have for the listeners?
Well, we need your involvement if you have ability. I can understand someone who's maybe in graduate school or something like that. I'm talking to clinicians now. If you're in graduate school in a secular program, don't jeopardize that necessarily. Don't compromise yourself totally, but don't jeopardize it. But when you get out and you are practicing, again, have wisdom about it, but I guess I'm participating in whatever way you feel led in this cultural moment and around these issues. Because like I said, I think it is fundamentally a worldview matter, and particularly an anthropological matter. Like, what does it mean to be an authentic person, right? Is authentic personhood totally divorced from our body, right? From the way God has created us? Is it just a matter of what we feel? And because sexuality is, kind of the main, such a big focus now, that becomes, who we are based just our sexuality, our sexual feelings? Or does our body have something to say about how we can conduct ourselves sexually in order to promote individual and societal flourishing, which is, of course, a more natural law perspective of the Judeo-Christian worldview, as opposed to what I would describe. And I appreciate Carl Trueman's account of this in the rise and fall of the rise and triumph of the modern self. I think he talked about expressive individualism, and I do see the validity of that as part of the explanation for what's going on. The authentic self is how I feel, my sexual feelings, and I have to express that to be totally authentic. Whereas from a historic Christian perspective, there's virtue in managing our passions and containing those passions for the good of society and the good of our family. It's a very different worldview. And so that's ultimately what's bubbling and colliding at the deeper level. And what you're seeing with therapy bans and things, I think ultimately that's really just a skirmish at the surface.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate everything you shared today, Dr. Rosik, and I hope you listeners have really had your brain stirred like mine has, and it's really challenging, and there's a lot of great resources Dr. Rosik mentioned, so I hope you check them out. So once again, thank you, Dr. Rosik. We appreciate it. And listeners, join us again next time here in the Mental Healthy Podcast, and we look forward to having another great guest then. So thank you so much, and bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Mental Healthy. If you want to hear more episodes, please hit the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts and head to linktree.com/mentalhealthypodcast for all of our social media platforms with the latest mental healthy content. If you have a story to share that relates to what we discussed in this episode or any other episode, please contact us at mentalhealthy2020@gmail.com. That's mentalhealthy2020@gmail.com. Thank you, and God bless.